Picture this. It's 1995 in Havana, Cuba. The streets are filled with classic American cars from the 1950s, Chevys, Fords, Buicks, all still running despite being cut off from spare parts for nearly 4 decades. Gasoline costs more than most Cubans make in a month. The U.S. embargo has strangled the island's fuel supply. And in a small garage on Calle 23, a mechanic named Julio Alvarez is about to do something that General Motors engineers would have called impossible. He's staring at a 1956 Chevy Bel Air with a blown head gasket and an owner who can't afford the $20 it would cost to fill the tank, if he could even find gasoline to buy. But Alvarez isn't thinking about gasoline. He's thinking about the gallons of used cooking oil that restaurants dump out back every night. Oil that nobody wants. Oil that's free for the taking. What if, he wondered, this 265 cubic inch V8 could run on French fry grease? This is the story of how one Cuban mechanic outsmarted 60 years of automotive engineering, created a fuel system so ingenious it was technically illegal under U.S. patent law, and accidentally sparked a revolution that would keep thousands of classic American cars running in a country that wasn't supposed to have them in the first place. To understand why Julio Alvarez's cooking oil conversion was such a middle finger to conventional engineering, we need to travel back to 1955, when Chevrolet introduced the small block V8 that would become the most successful engine in automotive history. Ed Cole's team at GM designed the 265 cubic inch power plant to do one thing exceptionally well: burn high-octane gasoline. The compression ratio was set at 8:1, perfectly tuned for the leaded fuel of the era. The Rochester 2-barrel carburetor atomized gasoline into a fine mist, mixing it with air at a precise 14.7:1 ratio for optimal combustion. Every component was engineered around gasoline's specific properties. The fuel pump delivered 5 to 7 psi of pressure, perfect for gasoline's low viscosity. The intake manifold was designed for gasoline's rapid vaporization. The combustion chambers were shaped to handle gasoline's flame propagation speed of about 30 feet per second. General Motors spent millions perfecting this chemistry, and the result powered everything from family sedans to Corvettes. But here's where things get interesting. By 1995, Cuba had been under U.S. embargo for 35 years. The Soviet Union, Cuba's primary fuel supplier, had collapsed 4 years earlier. Suddenly, an island that had been getting subsidized petroleum at 40% below market rate was thrust into what Cubans call the special period, a nice way of saying economic catastrophe. Fuel imports dropped by 85%. Gasoline, when you could find it, cost more per gallon than the average Cuban made in a week. Meanwhile, those classic American cars, the ones that tourists love to photograph, were bleeding their owners dry. A 1956 Bel Air got maybe 12 miles per gallon on a good day. At Cuban fuel prices, that worked out to about 45 cents per mile. For comparison, the average Cuban salary in 1995 was $20 per month. Something had to be done. Julio Alvarez wasn't the first person to think about running an engine on vegetable oil. Rudolf Diesel himself demonstrated his engine running on peanut oil at the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. But diesel engines and gasoline engines are fundamentally different beasts. Diesel engines use compression ignition. They squeeze air so hard it gets hot enough to ignite fuel without spark plugs. Compression ratios of 14:1 to 23:1 are normal. That intense pressure and heat can handle vegetable oil's higher viscosity and different combustion characteristics. Gasoline engines like the Chevy 265? Different story. They rely on spark plugs to ignite a carefully mixed air-fuel mixture. They run lower compression ratios. They're designed for fuel that vaporizes easily, burns quickly, and flows like water. Vegetable oil is thick as honey when cold, doesn't want to vaporize, and has a flash point of 600 degrees compared to gasoline's minus 45 degrees. So, what was actually going wrong when people tried to run gasoline engines on straight vegetable oil? First, the thick oil wouldn't flow through the fuel lines, especially in the morning when temperatures in Havana could drop to 65 degrees Celsius. Even if you could get it flowing, the carburetor couldn't atomize it properly. Instead of a fine mist mixing with air, you'd get globs of oil flooding the cylinders. The spark plugs would foul within minutes. Carbon deposits would build up on valves and pistons. The engine would diesel, keep running after you turned off the ignition, because hot carbon deposits would ignite the oil. It was a disaster. GM's engineers would have laughed at the attempt, but Alvarez understood something those engineers didn't. In Cuba, you don't have the luxury of saying something's impossible. You make it work with what you have, or you walk. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity. First, he installed a second fuel tank specifically for vegetable oil, keeping the original gasoline tank functional. This wasn't just redundancy, it was the key to the entire system. The engine would start on regular diesel fuel, which he could more easily obtain in small quantities and which shared similar combustion characteristics with vegetable oil but remained fluid at lower temperatures. Next came the heating system. Alvarez wrapped copper tubing around the exhaust manifold, creating a heat exchanger that would warm the vegetable oil to 180 degrees before it reached the engine. At that temperature, used cooking oil's viscosity drops from 40 centistokes to about 8 centistokes, almost as thin as diesel fuel at room temperature. This wasn't some random temperature either. Alvarez had tested various temperatures and found that 180 degrees Fahrenheit was the sweet spot where the oil flowed freely, but didn't start breaking down into harmful compounds. The real genius was in the dual-fuel switching system. The engine would start on diesel, run for about 5 minutes until the exhaust manifold was hot enough to heat the vegetable oil. Then a manual valve would switch the fuel supply over to the heated oil. Before shutting down, you'd switch back to diesel for 30 seconds to flush the vegetable oil out of the fuel lines, preventing it from solidifying overnight. But wait, there's more. The carburetor was a problem. It simply couldn't handle even heated vegetable oil properly. So Alvarez did something radical. He converted the gasoline engine to mechanical fuel injection. Using parts from a Soviet-era tractor and a Mercedes diesel pump he'd salvaged from a wreck, he created a hybrid injection system that could handle the higher viscosity and different burn characteristics of vegetable oil. The injectors themselves needed modification. Standard diesel injectors create a fine cone-shaped spray pattern designed for diesel's combustion speed. Vegetable oil burns slower, about 20 feet per second, compared to diesel's 25 and gasoline's 30. Alvarez re-drilled the injector nozzles to create a narrower, more penetrating spray pattern that gave the oil more time to mix with air before ignition. Then came filtration. Used cooking oil from restaurants came loaded with food particles, water, and various contaminants. Alvarez designed a 3-stage filtration system that would make modern biodiesel producers jealous. Stage 1 was a coarse filter made from layered cloth that caught the big chunks, bits of food, sediment, anything larger than 100 microns. Stage 2 used a modified oil filter from a Russian truck, catching particles down to 20 microns. The final stage was the clever bit. Alvarez used a centrifuge salvaged from a medical lab to spin the oil at 3,000 RPM, separating out water and particles down to 1 micron. The centrifuge was particularly important. Water in vegetable oil is catastrophic for an engine. It doesn't compress like oil, leading to hydraulic lock that can bend connecting rods and crack pistons. It also causes the oil to polymerize, basically turning into plastic, at high temperatures. Alvarez's centrifuge could remove water content down to less than 0.05%, making the filtered oil cleaner than many commercial fuels. The numbers were staggering. After Alvarez's modifications, the 1956 Bel Air could run entirely on waste vegetable oil that restaurants were paying to have hauled away. The cost per mile dropped from 45 cents on gasoline to just 5 cents on cooking oil, accounting for the small amount of diesel needed for startup and shutdown. That's a 90% reduction in fuel costs. Performance was surprisingly good. The 265 V8, which originally produced 162 horsepower on gasoline, was putting out about 145 horsepower on vegetable oil. Torque actually increased slightly from 257 lb-ft to 264 lb-ft, thanks to vegetable oil's longer burn duration, providing more consistent pressure on the piston throughout the power stroke. The engine ran quieter and smoother with less vibration than on gasoline. But here's the kicker. Emissions were dramatically cleaner. Vegetable oil is carbon neutral. The CO2 released during combustion equals what the plants absorbed while growing. Particulate emissions dropped by 50% compared to gasoline. There was no sulfur dioxide, virtually no carbon monoxide, and the exhaust smelled like a kitchen during dinner service instead of toxic fumes. In an ironic twist, this 1956 Chevy was now cleaner running than many modern vehicles. The engine wear told an interesting story after 200,000 miles on vegetable oil. Yes, Alvarez's Bel Air actually accumulated that many miles. He tore down the engine for inspection. The cylinder walls showed less wear than typical for a gasoline engine with similar mileage. Vegetable oil's superior lubricity had actually protected the engine better than gasoline. The only increased wear was on the fuel injection pump, which had to work harder to move the thicker fluid. Carbon deposits were a mixed bag. The combustion chambers stayed remarkably clean, with less carbon buildup than you'd see with gasoline. But the exhaust valves showed more deposits, a result of vegetable oil's incomplete combustion at lower RPMs. Alvarez solved this by recommending a monthly Italian tune-up, running the engine hard at high RPMs for about 20 minutes to burn off deposits. Word spread through Havana like wildfire. Within months, dozens of mechanics were knocking on Alvarez's door, wanting to learn the conversion. He taught them freely, seeing it as his contribution to keeping Cuba's automotive heritage alive. The modifications cost about $200 in parts, a fortune for most Cubans, but an investment that paid for itself in 3 months of driving. The conversions weren't limited to Chevys. Alvarez adapted his system for Ford flathead V08s, Chrysler Hemis, Buick nailheads, even the occasional Cadillac V8. Each engine required slightly different modifications. The Ford flathead's lower compression ratio of 6.8.1 actually made it easier to convert, requiring less precise injection timing. The Chrysler Hemi's hemispherical combustion chambers created better swirl, improving oil-air mixing, but required different injector angles to avoid wet spots on the chamber walls. By 1997, an estimated 3,000 classic American cars in Cuba were running on vegetable oil. Restaurants that once paid to dispose of their waste oil were now selling it to drivers. A black market emerged with premium oil from hotels that used cleaner fryer oil, commanding higher prices than oil from street vendors frying in the same oil for weeks. The technical challenges kept evolving. Cuba's tropical climate meant dealing with bacterial growth in stored vegetable oil. Alvarez developed an additive using locally available citric acid that prevented bacterial contamination. Cold starts during Cuba's occasional cool mornings, required installing glow plugs, basically heating elements in the combustion chambers, salvaged from diesel generators. One particularly clever innovation involved the cooling system. Vegetable oil combustion runs about 50 degrees hotter than gasoline. Instead of upgrading radiators, Alvarez installed oil coolers in series with the engine's water cooling system, using the waste heat to keep the vegetable oil at optimal temperature while preventing engine overheating. The fuel injection timing had to be advanced by 8 degrees compared to diesel specifications. Vegetable oil's slower burn rate meant injection needed to start earlier in the compression stroke to achieve peak pressure at the right moment. Too early and you'd get engine knock, Too late and you'd lose power and increase exhaust temperatures. Alvarez developed a simple mechanical advance mechanism using weights and springs, similar to old distributor advance systems, but applied to the injection pump. Let that sink in for a moment. A Cuban mechanic with no formal engineering degree had essentially reverse-engineered and improved upon 60 years of General Motors development, creating a fuel system that GM's own engineers hadn't even considered. The U.S. government took notice. The embargo explicitly prohibited the export of automotive technology to Cuba, but here was Cuba developing its own innovations that could theoretically violate U.S. patents, if anyone could figure out which patents applied to cooking oil conversions. The State Department issued warnings that Americans traveling to Cuba shouldn't bring back technical information about these conversions, as it might constitute illegal technology transfer. Think about that for a second. The U.S. government was worried about Americans learning automotive technology from Cuba. The environmental implications were staggering. If Alvarez's 3,000 converted vehicles each drove 10,000 miles per year at 12 miles per gallon, they were displacing 2.5 million gallons of gasoline annually. That's 22,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions eliminated, equivalent to taking 5,000 modern cars off the road. And this was achieved using technology from the 1950s running on restaurant waste. The conversions weren't without problems. Vegetable oil quality varied wildly. Oil from restaurants that fried starchy foods like potatoes was ideal. Clean burning with minimal residue. Oil used for frying meat contained animal fats that solidified at higher temperatures and left more deposits. Fish oil was disaster. The omega-3 fatty acids polymerized in the engine, creating varnish that could seize pistons. Alvarez developed a field test for oil quality. Heat a sample to 400 degrees and time how long it takes to smoke. Good oil took over 60 seconds. Bad oil smoked in under 30. He also created a compatibility chart, which restaurants produced which quality oil based on their menus. The Chinese restaurant on Calle 15, premium oil from vegetable-only wok cooking. The beachfront seafood place, don't even bother. Storage became an art form. Vegetable oil absorbs water from air, degrading quality over time. Alvarez designed sealed storage systems using old propane tanks, maintaining nitrogen blankets over the oil to prevent oxidation. He calculated that properly stored oil could last 6 months without significant degradation, though most was used within weeks of collection. The engine modifications kept evolving based on real-world experience. Early conversions suffered from injector coking, carbon buildup on injector tips that disrupted spray patterns. Alvarez solved this by adding a small amount of ethanol to the vegetable oil, just 2%, which changed the combustion characteristics enough to prevent coking while being produced locally from sugarcane. Compression ratios needed adjustment on some engines. The original 8:1 ratio of the 265 was actually too low for optimal vegetable oil combustion. Alvarez milled cylinder heads to achieve 9.5.1 compression, improving combustion efficiency by 15% while still avoiding detonation. Higher compression engines like the Chrysler 392 Hemi, with its 10.1 ratio, ran vegetable oil beautifully with minimal modifications. The economics went beyond just fuel costs. These conversions created an entire underground economy, oil collectors who knew which restaurants had the best oil, filtration specialists who could clean oil to fuel standards, mechanics who specialized in vegetable oil conversions, even chemists who tested oil quality and created additives. A cottage industry emerged from one man's garage invention. By 2000, Alvarez had refined his system to the point where conversions took just 3 days and cost less than $150 in parts. He'd written a detailed manual, hand-copied and passed between mechanics, since photocopying was scarce, that covered everything from initial engine assessment to long-term maintenance on vegetable oil. The manual included troubleshooting guides that would make factory service manuals jealous. Engine knocking, check injection timing and oil temperature. White smoke, water contamination in the oil. Black smoke, oil too cold or injectors need cleaning. Blue smoke, oil getting past valve guides. Time for new seals. Each problem had multiple solutions depending on available parts. One fascinating development was the creation of oil blends. Pure vegetable oil worked, but Alvarez discovered that mixing oils improved performance. A blend of 70% soybean oil, 20% coconut oil, and 10% palm oil had ideal viscosity and combustion characteristics. The coconut oil improved cold flow properties, while palm oil increased cetane rating, basically the oil's ability to ignite under compression. The conversions challenged everything automotive engineers thought they knew. GM spent millions developing fuel injection systems in the 1950s and abandoned them as too complex for mass production. Yet here was a Cuban mechanic creating reliable injection systems from salvaged parts. Detroit argued that alternative fuels required completely new engine designs. Alvarez proved that 40-year-old engines could adapt with simple modifications. Modern perspective makes Alvarez's achievement even more impressive. Today's biodiesel industry spends millions converting vegetable oil to methyl esters, basically using methanol and caustic chemicals to break down oil molecules into something more like conventional diesel. This process requires precise temperature control, careful chemical handling, and produces glycerin waste that needs disposal. Alvarez skipped all that. His system ran on straight vegetable oil with no chemical processing beyond filtering. No methanol, no caustic soda, no glycerin waste, just heat, filtration, and mechanical ingenuity. Modern biodiesel producers would call it impossible, yet thousands of Cuban cars proved otherwise every day. The comparison to modern technology is sobering. A 2020 Tesla Model 3 has a carbon footprint of about 18 tons just from battery production before it drives a single mile. Alvarez's converted 1956 Bel Air, running on waste vegetable oil, had gone carbon negative within its first year of operation. The 40-year-old mechanical fuel injection was more reliable than modern electronic systems that fail when a single sensor goes bad. Here's something to consider. We're told that solving climate change requires massive technological advancement, billions in investment, and completely reimagining transportation. Yet a Cuban mechanic with basic tools showed that existing technology from the 1950s could run carbon neutral with simple modifications. Makes you wonder what else we're overcomplicating. The story took an interesting turn in 2005 when European biodiesel researchers discovered Alvarez's work through academic papers published by the University of Havana. A delegation of German engineers visited Cuba specifically to study these conversions. They were stunned. Alvarez had independently developed solutions to problems they'd been struggling with for years. The Germans were particularly impressed by the dual fuel system. European researchers had been trying to develop computer-controlled fuel switching systems costing thousands of euros. Alvarez's manual valve system cost $5 and never failed. The Germans brought back design concepts that influenced a generation of vegetable oil conversion kits now sold across Europe. But Alvarez's influence went beyond just technical innovation. He proved that mechanical simplicity could outperform electronic complexity, that salvaged parts could match manufactured components. That innovation doesn't require million-dollar labs. Sometimes it just needs a problem that has to be solved. By 2010, an estimated 15,000 vehicles in Cuba ran on vegetable oil, including buses, tractors, and generators. The technology had evolved from Alvarez's original design, but retained his core principles: simplicity, reliability, and use of available materials. The conversions had saved Cuba an estimated 50 million gallons of imported fuel, worth nearly $200 million at international prices. The Bel Air that started it all? Still running. Now, with over 400,000 miles on vegetable oil, it had become something of a legend in Havana. Tourists paid to ride in it, not knowing they were experiencing a piece of engineering history. The engine had been rebuilt once at 300,000 miles, not because of vegetable oil damage, but normal wear. The fuel system Alvarez installed in 1995 still functioned with only minor maintenance. Testing by the Cuban Ministry of Transport in 2012 revealed something remarkable. Engines converted to vegetable oil in the 1990s were lasting longer than identical engines running on gasoline or diesel. The superior lubricity of vegetable oil had effectively preserved these antique power plants. Some showed less wear after 200,000 miles on oil than typical engines showed after 50,000 on gasoline. The economic impact was transformative. Families that couldn't afford to run their inherited American classics could now drive them daily. Taxi drivers saw their profit margins triple. Farmers could run tractors on oil pressed from their own crops. An entire segment of Cuban society that had been priced out of motorized transport was suddenly mobile again. The environmental data was equally impressive. A 2015 study by the Cuban Academy of Sciences calculated that vegetable oil conversions had prevented over 200,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions since 1995. Particulate pollution in Havana had dropped measurably in neighborhoods with high concentrations of converted vehicles. The distinctive French fry smell had become part of Havana's character, far preferable to diesel fumes. Yet outside Cuba, few people know this story. Julio Alvarez never patented his system. Patents mean nothing under embargo anyway. He never got rich from his innovation. He kept working in his garage on Calle 23, converting cars and teaching others until his death in 2018. His funeral procession included hundreds of vehicles running on vegetable oil, a testament to one mechanic's refusal to accept that something was impossible. What Alvarez achieved challenges our entire approach to transportation and energy. We spend billions developing new battery technology while ignoring that existing engines could run carbon neutral with simple modifications. We assume innovation requires massive investment, while a Cuban mechanic proved that creativity and necessity could overcome any budget limitation. We've convinced ourselves that environmental solutions must be complex, expensive, and high-tech. Alvarez showed they could be simple, cheap, and based on 70-year-old technology. His story is about more than just engines and oil. It's about human ingenuity triumphing over artificial limitations, about mechanical sympathy trumping electronic complexity, about solving problems with what you have instead of waiting for what you wish you had. Every classic American car running on vegetable oil in Cuba is a rolling contradiction to everything Detroit said was possible. They're proof that innovation doesn't always mean invention. Sometimes it means adaptation. That solutions don't always come from corporate R&D labs. Sometimes they come from mechanics who simply refuse to give up. In an age where we're told every problem requires a new app, a new technology, or a new investment, Julio Alvarez reminds us that sometimes the best solution is also the simplest. Heat the oil, filter it well, adjust your timing. And suddenly, a 1956 Chevrolet runs on restaurant waste. The American auto industry spent the last 70 years making cars increasingly complex, computerized, and impossible to modify. They told us this was progress. Then a Cuban mechanic took their oldest, simplest engines and made them run on cooking oil using basic physics and salvaged parts. Makes you wonder who really understood engineering better, the team at GM with unlimited budgets and advanced degrees, or the mechanic in Havana with ingenuity and vegetable oil. That 1956 Bel Air is still running today, now past 500,000 miles on vegetable oil. It's maintained by Alvarez's son, who learned the conversion technique from his father. The fuel system has been refined over the years, but remains fundamentally unchanged from what Julio Alvarez invented in 1995. Heat, filter, inject. Simple principles that outperformed everything Detroit's engineers said was possible. The next time you see a classic car, remember that somewhere in Havana, the exact same vehicle might be running on French fry grease. And it's not because of government mandates, environmental regulations, or corporate innovation. It's because one mechanic decided that impossible was just another problem to solve. What other impossibilities are we accepting simply because no one has been desperate enough to prove otherwise? What other solutions are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the courage to try? What could you achieve if, like Julio Alvarez, you simply refused to accept that something couldn't be done? That's the real lesson from Cuba's cooking oil cars. Innovation isn't about having the most resources. It's about using whatever resources you have in ways nobody expected. It's about seeing solutions where others see problems. And sometimes it's about recognizing that the best technology might be the one that's been sitting in front of us all along, waiting for someone clever enough to use it differently. If you know of any other underground engineering stories like this, innovations born from necessity that challenged conventional wisdom, drop them in the comments. These are the stories that remind us what human creativity can achieve when failure isn't an option. Until next time, remember, somewhere in Cuba, a 70-year-old American V8 is running on cooking oil, getting better mileage, and producing cleaner emissions than many modern cars, all because one mechanic refused to believe it was impossible.